But Bamzansi, Rona, we move different. We speak different. We're made different. But Bamzansi, we're brave. Not only are we a nation that appreciates those that died so that we could be born free, we're a nation that refuses to be defined by our past. But Bamzansi, we thrive. Pela, we have this ability to show utmost tenacity to achieve the unimaginable. A nation filled with innovative thinkers, generating ways to change the world and create a livelihood for fellow South Africans. We don't wait for an opportunity to knock. We're a nation brave enough to build a door using the spirit and vision of those who lived before us. But Bamzansi, we are one of a kind. We're a nation that unites and supports each other despite our differences. A nation filled with cultural richness. A nation that continues to break boundaries using our freedom of self-expression. A nation brave enough to believe in staying true to ourselves while remaining outstanding. And that's why in Mzansi, we trust.
Good afternoon. My name is Zengeziwe Msimang, and I am the CEO of the Oliver and Adelaide Tambo Foundation. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all here today. The Tambo Foundation is a public benefit organization that was established in order to promote, preserve, and protect the legacies of Oliver and Adelaide Tambo. We do this by undertaking community upliftment and advocacy initiatives that are education focused. Today, we have partnered with the OR Tambo School of Leadership and Brand South Africa to bring you this webinar, which is titled Growing Up on the Internet, Youth Socialization in a Digital World. As adults, we have experienced a gamut of emotions due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Fear, uncertainty, loss, resistance, grief, the list is endless. And we have also been forced to find new ways of engaging with one another, both in the workplace and in general. So what of our children? If we as parents, as adults, as grown-ups have struggled to adjust, how much so of our youth who are still in their development phases? Before the lockdown, there already existed a growing acknowledgement of the impact that the digital age had on how young people interacted with each other. What then is this? A new normal that requires today's youth to spend even more time in front of a screen than was already a cause for concern previously. We are aware that socializing is an integral part of young people's growth and development. So what then is the impact of basically growing up virtually? Before I introduce our facilitator, Ms. Naledi Mokoena, I'd like to introduce Mr. Shafi Varachia, who is a board member at the OR Tambo School of Leadership. Shafi recently completed his master's degree in London at the Cass Business School in Creativity, Innovation, and Leadership. In 2015, he completed his honors in actuarial science at the University of Witwatersrand. In 2014, he served as the SRC president, where he was actively involved in the Fees Must Fall campaign for free, decolonized, and quality education. His professional experience includes consulting, working in the financial services industry, and being the co-founder of startup, which is called the Mbengu platform. Shafi, it's an honor to have you here, and thank you so much for joining us to give the message of support today.
Thanks, Sengisiwe. And on behalf of the school, the OR Tambo School of Leadership, and its principal, Dr. David Masondo, I would like to deliver just a brief message of support. I would like to commend you, Sengisiwe, and the foundation, the OR Tambo Foundation, on putting this event together, as it asks some very difficult questions, and it asks us to consider how this world that is increasingly digital is impacting the youth and the development of young people. As I saw the poster and being interested in this world, I looked at a study called the Internet Minute and what it looks like in 2020. And just drawing on some figures for that, in 2020, 60 million WhatsApp and Facebook messages are sent in 1 minute. 200,000 people are tweeting. 700,000 people are scrolling Instagram. and 1.6 million people are swiping on Tinder. Those are just some of the platforms that have become increasingly dominant in our lives. And when you see these figures and you think about the amount of data that is being used on these platforms, one wonders if becoming a Luddite is the answer and checking out. Unfortunately, we know that that's not the answer. We can't simply as individuals check out of the system because we know how it's become all over in our world. The physical and digital realities have morphed into one. We've seen increases in cyberbullying, increasingly so during the lockdown. We've also seen the impact that the social media world has on things like elections. So from an individual level, right up to a macro level, we've seen this change in how we live. So as we unpack this very, very difficult question, I would want to commend our panelists for taking time to share with us their wisdom on this, to Dr. Dlamini, Lebogang, Zain, Naledi. I look forward to your comments. And as we go forward in dealing with this, to also have some ideas and to challenge the panel to speak about the design of our digital world and how we can do it in keeping with the principles and the values with which O.R. Tambo lived by. And as O.R. Tambo said in closing, the children of any nation are its future. And we need to protect that. And we need to increasingly design our digital world with the children in mind. Thank you, Zengisiwe.
And thank you so much, Shafi. Thanks so much for that. That 1 minute, it's that information is amazing. I mean, who would think that in just 1 minute, that much data is being passed from person to person? And what is that impact when we're talking about young people? So thank you very much for those insights and for those kind words. I'd like to hand over now to the young person who will be facilitating today. We have a number of them on our panel. As you can see, her name is Naledi Mokoena, and she is an educational psychologist and a lecturer. Naledi thrives on human development. She's currently working in private practice, administering psychotherapy and assessments. There, she provides psychosocial, educational, and cognitive support for children and young adults. Naledi also lectures at the South African College for Applied Psychology and co-founded the Choice Foundation Africa, which is an organization that runs projects to uplift Africans through youth development and mentorship. Naledi, thanks so much for joining us. We're really, really happy that you could be here today. And I'm going to hand over to you and leave it up to you to introduce our esteemed panel, the majority, I think, of which are still youth. So Naledi, I'm handing over to you. Thanks so much for facilitating today.
Awesome, thank you very much, Sangiswa. Yes, so the panel today, age under 35, predominant, most of us are under that age. But I think regardless, we're all quite young. So although we're having this conversation as adults, right? We consider ourselves adults. As adults, we're also youth, which means that we also are people who are deeply immersed within the social space, within the digital space. So I think it's also important for us to bear that in mind, because while we're having conversations as the older portion of youth, we ourselves are also immersed within the space. But then what does it also mean for people who are younger than us, right? Because we also serve as mentors to them. I'd like to say good afternoon to all members of the Oliver Adelaide Tambo Foundation and the Oliver Tambo School of Leadership. Thank you very much for having me today as a facilitator. Good afternoon to our esteemed panelists, and most importantly, to our audience members who have joined us. Thank you in advance. So we have had a backdrop in terms of the conversation for today, but just to add a bit more thinking from my side, I've been thinking about exactly what it does mean to be a youth in general, right, within today's world. But the advent of COVID-19 has brought about a whole other dynamic of things to think about. We've had sudden and massive changes in our daily lives. The pandemic definitely also brought about the deeply entrenched and structural inequalities in our country, with South Africa actually experiencing one of the harshest lockdowns, right? So regulations resulted in those with access to technology spending drastic amounts of time behind a screen. Children for sure were no exception to this. Many of them were educated online for a period of 5 months, that being the ones who actually had access to online mediums. Schools, guardians, and the youth themselves had to rely on technology and social media to feel connected to the world, to be connected from an educational perspective, and of course, to be connected to their loved ones. While the regulations of the lockdown have been lessened, we are still in a way of interacting today that is a result of the lockdown. And the type of way that we've been interacting in 2020 will continue to exist because it has become our new reality. And ironically enough, here we are actually having this important conversation also on a digital platform, right? So what does this all mean? What does it mean for people who are of youth is a priority? As a means of unpacking thoughts further and thinking about the implications of digital age, we have a panel of professionals who have joined us today. Thank you very much. Lebogang George comes from a legal background. So Lebogang carries a degree from Wits University. She's a legal consultant with a specialty in ICT law, information technology governance, as well as data protection and privacy law. Her experience spans across South Africa and the European Union. In 2019, Lebogang was selected to participate in the World Youth Forum that was hosted by President Adelaide Tambo in Egypt. This is a forum for inspiring youth to engage with heads of states, with youth leaders, and prominent international figures. Lebogang is currently working at Tambo Scott, a new age corporate commercial law firm. She has provided professional legal support in various projects, which focus on modernization and technology. That sounds very fascinating for me from a legal perspective. So welcome, Lebogang. Then our next panelist for today is Dr. Gabby Dlamini. Dr. Gabby is an associate lecturer at Nelson Mandela University's Department of Social Anthropology, including history. She's a social anthropology PhD candidate. Her current research focuses on social media and the online creation of material and immaterial value. Her master's thesis, titled Living Quietly, was on Emaswati middle-class migrants in South Africa. These research studies frame her broader interests on belonging, on relationships, and on representation of offline and online human communities in Southern Africa. Her other interests include issues advocating for equality and fair access to social and economic opportunities for all. Fascinating. And then our third panelist for today is Mr. Zamo Mbele. Zamo is a clinical psychologist, currently practicing as a senior psychotherapist and supervising psychologist at Tara H. Morris Hospital and at the Wits Donnegoda Medical Center. He is a candidate psychoanalyst. Zamo is also the vice president of the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, better known as SADAG, and a director of the Ubele Education Trust. We have some great minds here to have a conversation with us, very relevant to what we need to be speaking about today from different angles. So thank you very much to our three panelists. Hello from your side. How are you guys doing today?
I'm very well, thank you. I'll be the first to respond if that's okay. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for checking in. And good afternoon to everybody online. Thank you for the organizers, and thank you, as I said again, for the invitation.
Good afternoon. Hi, thank you very much for, hi, sorry Naledi. Thank you very much for having me, and I'm very interested in this topic. And I look forward to this afternoon and spending the time with you and chatting and seeing where we get to.
Hi. Hi, Naledi. Thank you so much for that. I look forward to this conversation. And once again, thank you for the invite.
Yeah.
For sure. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so let's jump into it. We're talking youth, talking digital age. We're talking 2020, right? We're talking the fourth industrial revolution. And what does this all mean for socialization for young people? So as a means of starting the conversation officially, I would like to pose a question to the three of you, right? What does it mean from your perspectives in terms of the idea that youth are growing up on the internet? We'll first hear from Dr. Dlamini. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so As an anthropologist, I like to use examples, and I tend to use examples from everyday life. And in this instance, I'll give you an example from my life. For example, I discovered YouTube. I didn't grow up with YouTube. I discovered certain parts of YouTube as I grew up. I grew up with YouTube being a link that I clicked on Facebook, and it would normally take me to a music video or a movie clip or something of that nature, right? And then one day I discovered other sides of YouTube, which are now quite common. So for example, vlogs and tutorials and all of this entire other side of YouTube, right? But the idea that I even have to discover it is the difference between me and the youth currently, where the youth, I mean, I have friends who have kids who can't imagine a life without YouTube and YouTube having all of those aspects, right? I have friends whose kids go to school and are having, and what they are on their laptops. And the kid can say, well, mommy's on Safari and dad is on Windows because this one uses Mac and this one uses, I was like, what's a browser? And I sort of had to think about it, right? But that's sort of like natural, sort of like all of these things that we have to discover and figure out and learn the terms for, they grow up knowing almost unintentionally, unconsciously. That for me is what I think about, or how I imagine when we say that kids are growing up in a digital space or the internet also.
Okay. And Lebogang, what are your thoughts on that?
I think just to add to that, I think we call them the digital natives, you know, because they are growing up on the internet. The internet is their playground. And they're actually teaching us. I mean, as much as I'm still a youth, but I learn a lot from them. I learn different terms. I learn about different websites and different apps. So they are the digital natives, and the world is coming for them quicker than ever before. Whether they're ready or not, they're forced to also grow up so quickly because information is ready at their fingertips. They don't have to research the way we used to research. You know, they can become instant experts. You know, it doesn't take you 10 or 20 years anymore to be an expert. So now they're becoming experts overnight because the relevance, what is relevant yesterday is not going to be relevant tomorrow, but they're the experts of today, you know, and that's what we're dealing with right now, our digital natives.
Digital natives, right, exactly. Zamo, from your side, what are your thoughts on that?
I was listening very carefully, and Lebogang, it sounded like you said the it-ernet, and I thought that's brilliant, because I think that it really just captures it, is that it is quite the it, isn't it? We really can consider it as the it-ernet. It's the thing to do, the place to be at this point. And I think my Freudian hearing was very relevant. I mean, I think I have quite a few thoughts and perhaps feelings about it, and I'm considering what to kind of pick out and to sieve out. And maybe a good place to start is the kids are growing up on the internet. And I was thinking about that sentence and the different ways you can consider it. The first one is kids are growing up on the internet. And again, we have such a variety of where to take that. I mean, I work clinically with adolescents. I teach and supervise working with young children, and I also work with adults who are parents. And it's incredible that the work of parenting, of growing up, is happening on the internet, which is problematic. However, I was also thinking about the idea of the kids are growing up on the internet, and that actually it's not all bad. And working with institutions, I consult quite a lot for educational institutions, is that actually there's a lot of growing up that you can do in a very healthy, productive way. On the internet, as well as, of course, profound dangers that exist there. And then the third point, when I was thinking the kids are growing up on the internet, was I recently contributed to a publication that looks at adolescent brain development. And I had to look and consider the impact of how growing up is being impacted by the internet. And I think I'm speaking to people who may not find this interesting because you know this. So I think a lot of people would be really surprised to know of the depth impact on even kind of brain structural development, both stunting and kind of facilitation and plasticity, so on both sides by the internet. So it's a huge world. And as I'm speaking, my last point is I get quite excited because I love speaking about this, and I love speaking about development, youth development, adolescent development, and all of that type of stuff. So yeah, I'm glad to be having this conversation.
Right. Yeah, so Zamo, you've actually touched on, I guess, the different angles that we need to consider, right? Because it's a very nuanced conversation that we need to have. We may sometimes have a negative standpoint on it. We may sometimes have a positive standpoint, but it's about then how do we actually think about the other side from which we naturally stand from, and what does this all mean for our youth today? As mentioned in the chat, just a quick aside, for people who are attending today, please feel free to join the conversation as we're going. If you want to make any comments about the conversation we're having on digital platforms, Tambo Foundation is available on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter. So please do add them when you send the message. And the hashtag that we're using for today's conversation is Tambo Webinar Series. Tambo Webinar Series. And please feel free to post questions as we go. And we won't only leave them to the end, so we'll do our best to actually tackle the questions that may come as we're having the conversation. Okay, cool. So then this next question I'd like to ask with regards to this is, I think, Gabby, I'll direct this towards you. Are youth interacting differently as a result of internet reliance?
I think every generation of youth interacts differently, right? How I interacted is different to how, for example, my eldest sister interacted, is different to how my mother interacted. That's why parents always say this generation, right? So they definitely are interacting differently in the same way in the things that they're able to do, the kinds of access that they have to things, the people in which they interact with, the ability for a 6-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old to be able to call an Uber and get themselves to wherever it is that they want to get to, right, is a different way of processing to me when I wanted to go to town and had to wait for my mother to come back, and this whole process, right, versus having that information already stored on your phone and being able to access it. The kinds of management that youth have to do in terms of thinking about money. You cannot download that game, even though the credit card details are on the laptop, because, so definitely kids are interacting completely differently, even with their friends. They have times when they go on the internet, when they're on WhatsApp, when they're on Instagram, you know, they schedule their social life around not only meeting up with their friends, but also what they do on their phone. Like, am I available on the phone? Am I not available on the phone? So the interactions are there, but it's not necessarily to say, again, whether those interactions or that the changes that have occurred are positive or negative, because they always occur in relation to the times in which we are living in, right? Similarly, how we changed and our socialization and our interactions changed because of the times in which we were living in, so are the youth adapting to the times in which they are living in. If I look at what the youth are doing now and I try to interact in that way, it potentially wouldn't work, and there'd be a lot more conflicts and tensions because the people I'm interacting with also are not used to. That's not the social contract we have with each other. That's not what we grew up and agreed to and account for as normal interaction. Whereas for them, many a times it's completely natural and normal to be having those kinds of interactions. So it's also becoming the value judgments in which we are placing on those interactions. We ourselves need to sort of look at them and say, where am I coming from when I judge these interactions?
Right. I'd like to ask a follow-up question back to you, Gabby, with regards to exactly what you said there. What's actually happening in terms of the engagement at a South African level? So has it affected any cultural norms? How is the digital age actually affecting how we interact with each other at a cultural level?
I think I don't know if we can actually specifically speak to, because culture is an evolving thing. As much as we do not want to accept it, culture changes, constantly changing. it's changed with me, it will change with everybody else, right? So because culture is always changing, constantly changing. But when we talk about culture, for some reason, we talk about a culture that's not changing, right? We talk about a culture that, and for some reason, when we talk about culture, apparently we all are talking about the same culture at the same time in history, at the same, and it's like, yeah, you know, back in the day, and like, which day exactly are we talking about? 1990, 1950, October, September, because I mean, so much can happen, right? But there are definitely changes in the ways in which, for example, the conversations I can have with my mother on WhatsApp versus the conversation and how I would approach her if I was speaking to her, for example, right, face to face. That's completely different. So even just that interaction, we're now at time, granted, we all interact with people differently depending on where we are. How I interact with my mother in town in front of people versus how I interact with my mother in front of family versus how I interact with her is completely different. But there's also that when we see how other people are interacting with their families and we understand the distance that technology allows us, but also the proximity that technology allows us, we tend to navigate those spaces of difference and proximity and distance in different ways, because I can do a prank now with my mother and she'll be a little bit more understanding when it's a prank for the internet versus if I was to just pull off a prank for no reason at the home, because then now I'm just being like naughty. So then that relationship with my mother now all of a sudden has become very playful when it wasn't before. So you're finding these differences, but you can't really then say, oh, there's a cultural impact in it, because culture has always been changing. Culture will continue to change. But the changes also are so nuanced in that I can't say that this change is specifically because of the internet and that change is specifically because of education and that change is specifically, they all change together.
Right. What I'm hearing you say there is that what's happening with this current age is that interactions that are happening even within families, with children and with parents, are no longer as, not in such a small, intimate environment anymore. If I'm, like you say, if you bring up a prank, if I do a prank on my parents, I then share the prank on social media, right? So our interactions are then informed by much more things apart from actually what's happening just in the home, but actually what's happening at a much larger and possibly even global level. So,
sorry.
Yeah.
No,
that's fine.
Go ahead. Yeah, I mean, I think that there is also then the sort of, so we have different kinds, right? So sometimes a person might be maybe well versed in terms of their culture and sort of have like, spend a lot of time in terms of grandparents and sort of, back home. Other people maybe have not experienced that, right? So social media and the internet allows that sort of like, if I don't know what my culture is, I can very easily find someone who does online and learn from them and sort of like incorporate those things into my own world. So also it's also changing in terms of, it changes things like sort of like who passes on that cultural knowledge, right? And sort of like those cultural interactions, like who's now becoming the expert in your culture. It's no longer the older people, it's now the young people who are living their culture and living their culture in various contexts, which means that they also, what you are also getting is, but it's also, it allows a little bit more, the informality of it all. But then if you also think about social media and how it tends to say, well, you put this on the internet, so it must be like this exactly. So it's always giving and taking. There's always like proximity and distance. It's always a tension. It's never just like, oh, it's going this way, and that's the only way that it's going.
Right.
Sorry, Nadi. I just wanted to like hop into that. Just and I think also what the internet does, it also allows young people to be innovative and just think outside the box when it comes to culture. Because personally, I also know friends that had to negotiate their Lola negotiations on the internet and via the internet because we were going through a lockdown. So they didn't want to wait after until the lockdown, and they didn't know how long that was going to take. So it actually was something that was different. Like, it's not normal for us to be negotiating lobola over the internet. Like, people are not used to that. Our people aren't used to that. All people are not used to that. But it's something that had to be done, and it opened them to things. And it just shows that culture is not stagnant. It has to evolve. And young people are the ones that are driving it now. Like Gabby said, it's not only old people anymore. The young people are the ones that are driving it, because they're the ones who are like, we have to have this negotiations, and they will happen, and this is how they're going to happen. So I think it just shows that culture can evolve and culture can adapt to the internet and what's happening.
Exactly.
Yep.
And now the question then, as a result of that, is, Zamo, direct this to you. What does that mean in terms of what youth are experiencing from an emotional level? Like, are they feeling more responsibility? Do they know that they are actually more leaders, that they have more power because of the social medium space, that they now have to lead their parents forward? Are they feeling that? What's happening in terms of how they're actually responding to this responsibility, so to say?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and I guess the best way to kind of respond to that is, again, to kind of think about youth in its very many variety. So very definitely, if we're speaking youth 6 to 12, there's a lot of excitement, because there's a lot of capacity, there's a lot of creativity. You can do so much more in reality. So I would say mostly there, it's a great deal of productivity and excitement. Look, there's also the danger of being set up, i.e. not to be able to achieve something that your colleagues are achieving. And there's also the danger of pressure, because you now have access to so many other people in many ways. And that's, you can see how that is going to be a massive factor when you start looking at adolescence. And I'm going to speak of adolescence in a typical way, which is probably about 13 to 19. So what we know is that the adolescence phase, we've now revised it. It's now 13 to 26, by the way, in very many ways. People are like, I'm an adolescent. And that's for, I'll tell you in 2 sentences why. It's because we appreciate that the development, both neurologically, so of the brain, and also its coordination with the emotional, actually we know continues up until 26. We actually even know that what is really very important is the front part of our brain, and that develops all the way until 26 and 25. So you can excuse yourself for all of the mistakes that you made until that age. And thereafter, it's all you. But anyway, you can imagine that.
Thanks for that.
So you can imagine then that the internet becomes something that really can come in again in a very positive adjunct way to ordinary development. So in adolescence, there's independence, there's dominance, there's actually taking charge. There's a great deal of actually wanting to go out there and be your own person. And there's so much more ability for that. There's so much more capacity to be social. And it creates such a substrate or a forum or a way for all of those experiences that you're going through, that you need to be negotiating, to be negotiated a lot more in a huge way. And that's quite exciting as well. I think that obviously, and again, with both the youth categories that I've referred to, the known kind of middle adulthood, there are also the real impacts of, and emotional impacts, of course, that come with bullying, that come with pressure, that come with distraction, that come with depersonalizations and dehumanizing, and so on and so forth, which can really scramble things in a very new way and in an incredibly nuanced way. One of the talks that I gave recently is about the fact that the internet is such an important tool because it really can bring things together, bring us together. We can speak a lot more, we can engage a lot more, and so on and so forth. However, it can really also distance. And that distancing is from something that's a lot more macro available to you. So when speaking to parents of young children, the distancing that can happen within families because screen time has taken away from quality time. And so there's distance there. And kind of that pre-adolescent stage where you should be socializing, but you're on the computer and on your phone, it's really depersonalizing, so on and so forth. All the way through to a depersonalization that comes the kind of characterological input that you're always getting, or influence that you're always getting. I mean, it's incredible that we speak about influences, though maybe without enough consideration that there is now a culture of people who tell you how to be, in a way, which is kind of from outside in. And again, it's like sugar. There's the initial rush of it. It's initially quite good and helpful and healthy. So you can imagine the long-term impact of not being able to develop from inside out in an organic way. And one last thing is, maybe not so related to your question, Naledi, is I was thinking when Gabby, you were speaking, I was thinking, I absolutely agree around the problems that we face when we speak about culture as if it's this ossified thing in a particular time. And I absolutely agree. I think culture is evolutionary. And I think South Africa in particular, or Africa, we have a problem with culture because of the link we're not making to trauma and what was done to a culture. So there's this wanting to hold on to something because of previous exploitations, colonial included. But that's a different topic. So I was also thinking about that the internet is a culture, actually. There is cancel culture, there's meme culture, there is Instagram culture. So we are at the vanguard, actually, of a culture. And I think we would be better served by appreciating that it's not just meeting cultures. The internet, it's not coming in and interacting with cultures. It is the culture, it's starting culture, and so on and so forth. And we need to know that and study it.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Exactly. So now, Lebo, I'm thinking about this, like safety, right? Safety, legal implications of all this. We're talking about, we have to deal with the fact that this is the culture that we're in, right? Younger people understand it better than we do. But at the same time, like we said, if we're dealing with people who are young, let's think about what Zamo mentioned about the prefrontal cortex. If someone is at the age of 16, they haven't actually developed the concept of, if I do this, it actually means this. Consequences are not as evident to them, right? As they may be someone who's 30 years old. Well, we hope at least. So in terms of like the safety of it, what then should parents be aware of? Let's first talk about children who are younger than 18. What kind of safety precautions do they need to be aware of from a legal perspective? What can kids get into that their parents need to be aware of?
Okay, I think.
Sorry, can I interrupt there, Lebo, before your answer? Sorry, that it might edify if it's okay, because what you bring up, Naledi, is incredibly, really fascinating. Though, I just wanted, for I suppose edification is that what we know about youth, and this is fascinating, is that they actually do as much consideration as adults around a decision, right? Sometimes even more. And so, the internet actually gives them a lot of information. So what we know the difference is that in adolescence, there is an overvaluation of reward as opposed to consequence. So actually, oftentimes, if you ask a young person, they'll know, I would have gotten into detention. I could have gotten pregnant, and so on and so forth. We could have had an accident. We could have gotten, there's an appreciation. However, the reward is so much more appealing during adolescence than the actual consequence, which is a fascinating distinction to make and really helpful to kind of consider why they make stupid decisions, so to speak.
Right. And we'll definitely get into that because I think it speaks to the notion of instant versus delayed gratification. So that's a good point to mention. Yeah, so Lebo, let's talk about the safety aspect. What safety precautions do we need to do parents or guardians need to be aware of?
I think first and foremost, parents or guardians need to embrace the internet as well. They need to be digital parents and be able to manage their kids and be able to know how to navigate technology and navigate the sites and know what apps are there. So they also need to educate themselves so that they know as much as their kids know, or even more than their kids, so that they're able to know what their kids are getting into, what the ramifications of those apps are, what those websites have, what happens on those websites, who follows those kids who are on those websites. So I think the most important thing is they need to manage their kids, because what is important is that as a parent, don't talk about privacy. Your child has no privacy. What's important is your child's safety over your child's right to any privacy. That trumps that. So as long as your child is safe and you're taking proactive steps to make sure that your child is safe, that's the most important thing. And there are apps that you can block. So just to make sure that you block certain apps, certain websites, because at the end of the day, they're under your roof and you're the one who who is responsible for them. So you manage that and you block whatever apps they're on, whatever website that they can access. Make sure that you block or you limit that, you know, and have a conversation with them. I mean, at the end of the day, children can also be understanding. Children are people that you can talk to and have a conversation with them and ask them, what is it that you're on? What are you doing on there? Because if you have an open relationship and a conversation with them, if anything happens, for example, cyberbullying happens or something inappropriate happens, they can actually come to you and they can let you know that something inappropriate is happening. You know, and I think that you also need to let your kids know that they can't hide under the whole thing of their minors, so nothing's going to happen, because there are criminal procedures that can be kids can be charged for certain things that they do on the internet, even when they're minors. So if they're exchanging inappropriate content, they can actually be criminally charged. And I think those are conversations that you need to have with your kids and say, listen, even if you're 13 or even if you're 12, if you're exchanging something that's inappropriate, pornography or naked pictures, you can still be held liable, you know, even if it's consensual. The fact is you're a minor, you're not supposed to be doing those things. So make them aware that there are criminal implications, and those criminal implications will follow them up until adulthood, and it can affect their career and it can affect their lives. So just be open with them and have those conversations with them and let them know that there are consequences legally, even as a minor. It does not just apply when you're older. And I think also just like I said, you monitor your kids, monitor what your kids do, and make sure that if your kids are using the internet and they're using technology, just make sure they're using it in a space where you can also monitor them and ensure that, like I said, just keep educating yourself about what is out there and what is happening, different apps, new apps, or educate yourself.
So, Lebo, I like what you said there, because it's like thinking about the legalities of it at a parental level. You know, what does the law say? But then, what does this mean for me? And I think so. If you have this conversation with your child and say the implications of you being online are this, right? They'll kind of be like, okay, but you're saying this to me, but my friends are doing it. People are definitely sharing online. They're sharing pornographic pictures. So how come nothing has happened to them? So I think the question I'm going to ask you back is, what then, at a very strict structural level, what is permitted and what's not permitted on sharing, so that as adults we can know, and therefore children can also know?
So, I mean, the thing that's obvious is they cannot share pictures of themselves, naked pictures of themselves, nude pictures, nude photos, that they cannot share. So even if they're consenting, even if they're 13 and they're both 13, they cannot do that, because that is also seen as a criminal offense. And there is juvenile, I mean, in South Africa, you know, kids can go to jail for such things, kids can be fined for such things. So that is something that they don't want to find themselves doing. And as soon as we have this Sexual Offences Act, they really don't want to find themselves as a minor in that list, you know, because that can have implications when you're an adult and when you're trying to look for a job. So I think just be honest with them and let them know you can't share any sexual content at all. Even sexting, something like sexting, you cannot do that. People think it's innocent, it's fun, there's no harm done, but sexting is also seen as something that is harmful. And if you're doing it even at 13, like I said, and you're both 13 doing it, it's also a criminal offense. And a mother or a guardian, or you can go and you can lay charges and say, this is what's happening. A child is sexting. This is content that should not be shared between young people.
Right. So one of the audience members today is actually asking, this is a comment that's been put forward. I am worried about the safety of our children. Although there are parental measures for child safety, many parents have found that perverts are able to infiltrate. Right. So the safety is there. So I guess the question is, what apps are these? Like, how does a person then stop a person from infiltrating? Because then the good point is that it's not always the child's fault. Sometimes it's other people actually infiltrating the child's space.
I think also it's also having the conversation with the child and to make them more aware of the type of people that they're interacting with, and to make them aware of what is right and what is wrong. Because even though there's certain things you can do, there's settings that you can apply on Google to try block certain things, put age limitations and restrictions, your children are smart. They can outmaneuver you, they can cheat the system and act like they're older, you know. But I think educating them and letting them know and having a conversation with them and letting them know what is appropriate and what is not appropriate and what is right and what is wrong. And I think that's the best thing, because there's so much that you can try to limit things, you can try to block apps, but if somebody manages to get through to your child, is having that conversation to say, this is inappropriate. When a guy or a girl asks you for this, it's inappropriate. You know, there are criminal implications to it as well. Also, it can be harmful. You know, have an honest conversation with your child. I think we need to stop not having these serious and real conversations with our kids for fear that, oh no, it's too serious, oh no, we can't talk about sex, oh no, we can't talk about rape. You have to have those conversations, because this is how, unfortunately, kids end up in these situations where they are groomed on the internet, because we don't have conversations with them about what grooming is. We don't have conversations with them about sexual groomers and predators out there. We don't show them how it looks like. Have a candid conversation. If you need to show them in a message how it looks like, show them how it looks like so they are aware, because sometimes, honestly, they don't know what it looks like, and that's why they end up in these situations.
Right, exactly. So another question, it's actually been posed for Lebogang, but I want to angle it just more towards Zamo. So the person here is saying that when I was still in high school, I could still access sites which were blocked. There are codes that you can manipulate, right? So we know that our children actually have a better sense of how to manipulate these things than we do. Unfortunately, you also can't control deleted history or what friends show your child. I'm quite keen to know how you can outsmart digital natives to keep them safe, if that's even possible. Zamo, what do you think about that? Let's think about the young mind. How can we outsmart them? Is the question.
Right. So the kind of more difficult answer that I'd give to that is you cannot outsmart it. And by the time that you're wanting to do that degree of outsmarting, you've missed the boat in reality. And that's, you know, that's really probably not popular to hear. Though I absolutely agree with Lebo that, you know, you need to parent, which includes, and you need to adult, which includes inserting boundaries and parameters that are necessary in order to protect your child, and also responding and attending to matters that can be harmful to your child until they're no longer a child. Really, you do need to do that. However, the best case scenario would be to have a relationship, a good enough relationship, that when your child does bump into these things, there is good inside of them. So there's enough kind of psychological development in terms of how they're going to bump into it, because they will bump into porn, they will bump into predators, they will bump into people who want to exploit them and bullies. They will, and in fact, actually, they should. And the early installation, which includes the relationship, which includes the openness, so on and so forth, will be what determines how they bump into that in a huge way. So go ahead.
No, sorry. So you said that they should. Elaborate on that, please. Why do you mean that they should?
So I suppose I'm saying the should to the extent that there isn't any help in a sanitized, in my opinion, in a sanitized way of being brought up, you know, because the world is not that way. Relationships are not that way. And actually part of what one needs to develop are the tolerances of frustration, the tolerances of distress, and the management and negotiations of an attempt to be exploited, because it will happen in a huge way, you know. And I think we can get underdevelopment from pediatrics, nutritional, though we can also get psychological underdevelopment where there are not enough experiences, skills, and tools acquired and made contact with by an individual from an early age, which means that when they go into adulthood, they collapse or implode, or, you know, with all of those demands, you know, in a huge way. I think they also should, to the degree that I think healthy development requires a degree of frustration for the development of grit, for example, or a degree of delayed gratification for the development of discipline. and so on and so forth. So you actually do need to bump into those in order to develop the really helpful additional defense mechanisms and other kind of character traits in a huge way. So to return a little bit to your initial questions, how do you outsmart them? And I think that the additional way to look at it is to say, how do you collaborate with them in a way that actually there is enough appreciation, even though they hate the fact that you are banning them from this or you're restricting this, there's enough appreciation of the collaborative relationship that they can abide by that too, you know, in a huge way. And that if they outsmart you, that they can actually come back and say, you know, yesterday we did some experimenting, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And that the consequence will not be too devastating for them, that they need to hide it from you, because then it can snowball and it cascades into additional consequence. Oh my goodness, I had sex without protection and now I am pregnant. So the first one is not spoken to you. And then the second one is also not spoken to you. And then it leads to the third one, which is kind of less appropriate and what kind of terminations and so on and so forth. You know? Yeah, I mean, I hope that kind of answers it. It's not a simple answer because these things are not simple. And mostly I'm saying that the work is done before adolescent, hopefully, and before young adulthood. So, you know, we know, And then the second response is that much more of a collaborative, much closer relationship is probably the way to go about it.
Yeah.
Right. So I hear, Gabby, I hear you are humming a lot. So I think your mind must be racing at this point in time. I'm just thinking, so we're having this conversation and we're speaking about youth and young people, right? And Zamo, what I'm also hearing you say is that it's important to actually get in there at a younger age. But now children don't live in a silo, right? And there's, at the end of the day, they have their own minds and they know a lot about this particular digital world, but at the same time, they are being brought up by adults. So I then want, Gabby, I just want to direct it towards you in terms of, let's think about the intergenerational dynamics that exist, right? Young people, older people. Again, and we're actually even talking different levels here. We're talking about people below the age of 20. We're then also talking about people 30s to 45 maybe who are bringing up young children. And then we're also talking about people from maybe 50 and 60 who are now at the end, like basically bringing up like their kids towards the end of their childhood. So what are intergenerational dynamics that exist that also then play out in this whole space?
That's a difficult one. That's a difficult one. I mean, I think I want to give another example. I'm really good at ethnography. Just take from people and what people are doing, right? But I'll try and use, I'm trying to use examples from my life because I haven't ethics and all sorts of things. So I'm not just being like self-absorbed, but so for example, I have a very elderly mother. My mother's 74, right? Okay. My sister is in her late 40s, I'm in my late 30s, and my niece is 18 currently, right? So myself not being a digital native, we went through a period of you're not allowed Instagram, right? Until she just got the Instagram, and one day I was like, something slipped, and it was like, what does that mean? And then it was like, okay, you know how your mother feels about this. I'm going to leave it to you to tell her, but I will have to tell her because this is important. And the reasons why she didn't want you to have Instagram was because of A, B, C, and D, right? She still says I blackmailed her into telling her mother, but it was important. It was an important thing because we all needed to know that this was now happening, right? Similarly, I can't WhatsApp my mother because my mother doesn't know how to use WhatsApp. So the four of us are sitting at different places with the internet. I have a parent who completely just is looking at this thing from the outside in and has no sort of like, she's like, okay, you are in the internet. Like, it's almost like a place I go to open the door and I'm like, okay, I'm here now, right? Versus my sister who's sort of like, okay, how do I post a tweet, but also has a Twitter account? versus me who has like, you know, is playing around in social media, but still very scared of it and sort of like what it means for myself and, you know, how do I interact and whether I really should be here or not, and all sorts of other things that I'm dealing with once I'm in that space. And then at the same time, we have this child who is using the social media, and her social life is completely embedded within social media, to the point where it's easier to send her a message on Instagram than it is on WhatsApp. Like if I really need to get hold of her, I'll send her like a DM, because that's important. So the intergenerational gift stuff is very nuanced. And similarly, which also speaks to the conversation that was being had about the security and the security risks that are happening. The internet is a place for people's particularisms to play out, right? So for example, my niece has to understand Twitter as a page and how people engage on Twitter versus understanding how people engage on Instagram. So when she sees particular things on Twitter and she sees those very same things on Facebook, right? If my niece sees a person in a bikini on Twitter versus seeing someone in a bikini on Facebook, those could mean two completely different things. And she needs to be able to tell those differences and those nuances. And as a parent, I need to understand that when I see a bikini on Twitter, I shouldn't go throw my towels in and be like, oh my God, I can't believe that you're doing this, right? So I, as you were saying, as Zamo was saying and Lebogang was saying, that I need to be invested in the time that's happening as someone who's engaging with generations and trying to participate in molding somebody, right? I need to take the time out to actually learn what these spaces are about, versus my niece who completely understands that, okay, the differences and the nuances of all these different platforms, and this is what they mean, right? The rest of us need to actually go sit there and say, okay, what does this mean? And why is someone tweeting? Why are they being so rude? Well, actually, they're being so rude because they only have 240 characters. They don't have time to post a 5-page Facebook post that tells you the history of how they got to where they're going and all of those things. So I think that like the intergenerational stuff has a lot to do in terms of our own initial reactions when we see something on the internet, depending on where we are in the age gap or the generation gap. Our reactions are completely different. But what is actually coming across is that the older generation needs to make the effort, because things are changing, and they will continue changing with or without us. And if we are going to in any way have some sort of semblance of participating in the growth of kids right now, we need to understand the spaces in which they are growing up in, and not the other way around, which tends to be what actually happens. We expect kids to adapt to our life when actually we are living in their world. We expect kids to consider face-to-face interaction with the same sort of like value and quality that we consider face-to-face interaction, when that's actually completely unfair to them, because that's not, you know, that's not their sort of like social development and social value system. That's not what it is.
Mm-hmm. Right. Some aha moments. It's funny because we're having this conversation as adults, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we don't have, it's like we're doing this lens. We're having a lens from like the top down lens. And maybe what we actually forgot in this conversation is to have a more like straight lens, and we could have done that by actually having a person of younger age to actually have this conversation with. And that's the other thing, that when we're talking about these things, that we should also remember to actually include people from different perspectives, i.e. the children we're actually talking about, to also add their point of view, right? Lebogang, I saw you nodding a lot. Do you have any thoughts on what we're speaking about right now?
Yeah, no, I was completely agreeing with Gabby about the fact that adults and parents and the older generation, they're the ones who also need to do the work, you know, and they need to be more collaborative, and they need to be more invested in technology and in what their kids are doing, because like Gabby said, it's either you adapt, you know, because it's not going to change, you know, technology is going to be more advanced in a couple of years. If anything, it's not like it's going to regress, and it's not going to be as advanced. It's going to be even worse, you know. So you need to embrace it. You need to learn about it. You need to sit with your child and adapt to their new world, and don't expect them to go back and look at your world, because your world does not serve them, and they can't survive if they're going to be stuck in your world. And it's for their own development, for you to invest in their world. You're helping them to develop, because that's their world, essentially.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was doing a little bit of reading with regards to like the use of digital within South Africa, and in South Africa, even considering our high Gini coefficient, 40% of people are actually using social media, right? 40% is a high proportion, which means that we have children across different socioeconomic levels who are actually interacting in the social media space. And truth be told, they're probably also using it for their own social mobility, right? For their own economic mobility. So there's a question here in line with what we're speaking about. And I guess I'll throw that to all three of you. Considering that there are negative and positive effects, what role do you think the digital technology providers should and can play? For example, do we need more insight and regulation, or do we still prioritize privacy and broad level access? Lebogang, do you have any thoughts on that? What role should digital technology providers play within this whole space?
I think what needs to happen is we need more privacy laws and privacy regulations that are clear. And the reason, and it's not because I want an over-regulation of the internet and what we do on the internet. I think it's for safety purposes, because we all know that data is a commodity and it's very valuable. And our kids put out a lot of information there. And we want our kids to play in an environment that is safe and in an environment that is conducive. So we need privacy laws and privacy regulations to ensure that our kids are safe, because kids put a lot of things on the internet without knowing. You know, they can take pictures without knowing that they're taking pictures of themselves, but at the back is their address where they stay, or it's information about, they're taking a picture and then there's information about their credit card or their parents' credit card. So they have no idea that they can open themselves up to personal information that is out there, and for criminals and for cyber criminals to attack. So I think we just need regulations in terms of privacy, because private information is readily available, and kids are very vulnerable, and kids do not know what they're putting out there. And I think it's just for the benefit of the kids. And we don't need, I think in terms of regulation and laws, the privacy laws are the ones that need to be there. We have other laws, like the Criminal Procedure Act does govern any criminal activity that happens. We have the Films and Publications Act, which governs pornography and child pornography. So those are already in place. So I don't think we need an over-regulation, because we still need free speech. We still need to do things on the internet freely. I think what we just need is to make sure that our personal information is protected, and our kids' personal information and our kids' identity is protected.
Right, okay. So the regulations are there, but it's about then how we're applying them in our personal spaces.
Absolutely.
Right, okay. Zamo, I want us to speak about, let's go into the conversation about socialization particularly, right?
You have a sociologist, I think, right there.
Zamo?
let me abide by it.
Are you softly referring on? He sounds like he's softly referring on.
Go for it.
No, in terms of the socialization, okay, 40% of people in South Africa are on social media. How then is it actually affecting how children are socializing at a very simple level? Whether that means socializing out there in the world, whether that means socializing at home, just in general, socialization, how we grew up in the early 2000s versus socialization today, what's happening?
Yeah, and that sounds like a really great PhD topic, actually, in very many ways. I'll give it the best response that I can. And I'll start a little bit. I was listening to when Lebogang was speaking, and I was thinking that, there are, for example, some really good regulatory policies that have come in from the social media position. So the work that I do with SEDEC, for example, we have a great partnership with Facebook and really try to improve their reading of posts for the purposes of picking up pathology, and most of the time picking up like suicidalities and responding to that. Now that is a small to huge achievement that we've been able to do. So I hope you can see in that regard that there's something about the possibilities that exist in terms of regulation, that it's not always bad if it's, you know, an involvement, and how if you harness the power of technology as opposed to work against it, especially for young people, and rarely we see this in in three categories. You see it in teens, you see it in kind of young first year, second year university students, and then you see it in young adults, and the expression of distress and particularly suicidalities, and we can respond in that way. That's the way that we need to be going, and I think that kind of encompasses the idea of collaboration in huge ways. And we can even go further. You know, part of what would be trying to build, which takes forever, is an algorithm for even mania and an algorithm for depression. So checking how a person participates. I mean, if you're on the socials between 12 to 5 regularly, persistently, as a clinician, I can tell you that that's oftentimes an indication of insomnia. And I can tell you that that degree of insomnia can either be kind of a mania of a bipolar, or it can be a depressive, low mood insomnia of a depression, and I can potentially intervene. So you can see the possibilities are great.
Zamo, can I pause you for a second before you continue?
Go for it.
Please help us with layman terms. Mania.
So mania is the elevated mood. So manic episode, elevated mood, oftentimes present in a bipolar. So the person has a lot of energy, they're not sleeping, they're doing a lot, they're speaking very fast, and so on and so forth. You know, that's what we typically refer to as manic episodes in a bipolar disorder, when it's really, really thing. And then kind of insomnia of a depression, you know, people not sleeping. I mean, so you can see the possibilities of being able then to either tacitly or explicitly, the adverts change all of a sudden to do you need help, and awareness on mental wellness and mental illness that can really help a person, and even alerts. So being able to pick up that something is wrong and have an alert function that it automatically lets a friend know to check in with you, and thinking. So there's great, I mean, innovation is key. And I think that, anyway, it's really key. I wanted to return to your question, which is around socialization and huge impacts, many impacts, very many that we probably do not quite know yet, you know, that are really out there. One of them that I have looked at is the kind of distinction between social media contactless that brings socialization. So you are interacting and you're doing something to come together, to find other minds, to realize where you begin and end, to actually bump into people, to bump into yourself when you bump into people, to know, you know, that's why socializing is actually very important. You meet yourself when you meet people. In many, many ways, including a whole host of other things. You learn, you modify, you know, it's very great in that regard. So that would be, for example, such meetings. It would be the ones we're having today. It would be kind of Zoom parties. There was an app called House, which was very popular and that we want to encourage. You have that app, don't you, Naledi? You're familiar with it. Right. So then,
I downloaded it. I'm guilty.
Right. Well, good on you guys. Really good on you. However, there's also then the anti-socialization that media can bring with it, and you see it a lot in, or actually across the spectrum. You know, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, socials can really be anti-socializing. And we know that, right? As well as regular screen timing. So Netflix, YouTube, and so on and so forth can be anti-social, and gaming, anti-socializing. The reason, now we know that and we can take it for granted. However, what we find is that it's so much more difficult to catch that because it looks and feels like you're socializing, you're not. So in this mutative state, it's the advanced form. You see, back in the days, I can say that. What would happen is that you were easily caught out not to be socializing because you were staying home and you were staying in your room. So it becomes apparent that you're not socializing. However, it's not apparent that you're not socializing when you're on your phone or when you're out and on your phone and when you are active on the socials. And so it's almost chameleoned itself, and it's so much more difficult to see and catch, which is where it is so much more dangerous in many ways. And the kind of young adult version, which I'm currently looking at, is also, for example, this idea that you have so many friends on Instagram, when in reality, there isn't actually any real friendships that are intimate, true, and so on and so forth. And that can be incredibly dangerous, because then the symptom persists without it being caught for very many people. And really, and if you, I'm just thinking about the ethics of this for a second, though, if you do work with kind of high volume friend influences, kind of in a psychotherapy or whatever, you might soon realize that 10,000 followers, those 0 friends, is something that is quite a pattern, actually, in very many ways.
Right, exactly.
So I mean, we now appreciate the dangers, really, that it's beyond kind of even a conversation for conversation's sake. And as I say, particularly as a clinician, I really, this is something that I consider and work with.
Right. Okay. So Zamo, there's a question just in line with what you've spoken about now. Would be
intimacy.
Yeah. Exactly.
Is that it?
And how you define intimacy, given that you don't deal with social relationships as such, but more individual ones?
Yeah. Very good question, and I'm not too certain how to answer that in reality. I can speculate a few variables that I think might be helpful, and I can speculate perhaps a few characteristics of intimate. And the first one is probably discomfort and comfort. So a relationship where you can feel safe, secure, and comfortable, as well as has the potential to take you to places inside of yourself that you may not feel as comfortable with as well, because that's an indication of depth and an indication actually of exploration and discovery in huge ways. Finding out things about yourself which are incredibly insightful and delightful to find out, because it's a safe environment to do that, as well as finding out things about yourself which are inherent and instinctual, that are also difficult to find out about. They'll also give you an opportunity to be aware of, master, and maybe work on. So, I mean, it's a bit of an ambiguous one, maybe to get out of jail free, though I do think that it is a relationship which has a great deal of vulnerability, though a vulnerability that is within absolutely the boundaries of pure safety and comfort in that regard. Yeah.
Right. So I guess what I'm hearing you saying with regards to that is that when people are on the online space, when you're able to get lots of information, you're able to interact, you hear different perspectives and different points of views when you're on social media, right? But then in terms of making that intimate, how then you take that and bring it into your personal self. With having a relationship with another person, you're then able to see what you've learned. How does that come out when you're interacting with another person? Are you safe to actually explore what's out there in the world with an individual at a personal level? And I guess that's where the one-on-one person interaction is important, even if you're dealing with a globalized world.
Makes me think of two things, actually, Naledi. One of them is that, for example, when working with infants and toddlers, what you look at is kind of circle of security, where if the relationship between parent and child and infant and toddler is strong enough, that the child can actually go out and explore, because they can also come back because they know that there's a safe place in a way. I think I wanted to add that in terms of intimacy, is also a relationship that allows you not just to be in it, though actually also to go out with a degree of safety. And then I thought the second thought that I had, where I was thinking, I didn't mention characteristics, and I suppose one of them is deliberateness and iteration. So it's again and again and again and again and again and again, right? Whether it's every day, every week, or whatever the case is. It's not once off or and thingy, as well as very deliberate and uncurated. So a relationship where there isn't so much of a management or curatorship of who you are and how you are. Yeah. And you can see how Instagram is very apt, right? Because it's very curated.
Right, yeah. And I think that's also how TikTok is probably changing things up a bit, right? It's still a space where it's still a performance space, but the curatativeness, what's the word? The curation, that one, is altered a little bit. Gabby, so if we think about socializing online and socializing offline, what's the difference there, right? Both of them are happening. Both of them will continue to happen. So what's the difference in terms of what's happening in the different spaces? Because I think once we understand how socializing offline and socializing online is different or the same in whatever way, we can then see how the two can play together in a way that works towards more healthy development.
Conversation that was happening, because funnily, sort of the industry, the influencer industry has brought up, right, is actually this intermingling of this intimacy and these intimate relationships into these very public spaces, but not only just very public spaces, but into a money economy. So my relationship, my very intimate relationship with my partner or my best friend becomes something that I make public, and public not in an intimate way, but public, but selling the intimacy of the relationship, right? In order to make it economically viable at some point as an influencer for the engagements, for this, for the that, which ultimately leads to a paycheck at the bottom end, right? So I think, like, you know, that's also another level of the ways in which kids are having to navigate their relationships. They're having to sit there and actually sit down and think about, what kind of a friendship is this? Is this an intimate friendship? Is this, and this is something most of us probably didn't have to do until we're probably in our 20s. And we're like, maybe this is not a friend for me. But a lot of kids now are having to have this conversation and these thought processes a lot earlier in their lives, where, you know, back in the day, it was like, will you be my best friend? Yes, I'll be your best friend. And then that was that. But now, why do you want to be my best friend? Can I post you on Instagram as my best friend? Can we do these things together? And no. So it's very hard to kind of like speak to what does socializing, or what are the interactions like offline versus online. It's very easy for me to speak about offline interactions, offline versus online, because I have that distinction, right? It's not so easy to speak of those distinctions when you are much younger than I am, and your social life is happening on social media as well as happening at home. So the very friends that I consider to be my deepest friends, who come over for sleepovers, also need to learn how to not put up that picture that they know will embarrass me, right? Even though they look good in the picture, they must now sit there and decide, do I want to put a picture that I look good in, or do I want to put up a picture that makes both of us look good in, right? So that's one of the considerations, which is something most of us probably didn't grow up having to think about. But when we talk about sort of like those relationships have to be able to pass through both the public space and the private space and still remain intact. Whereas if you have relationships that don't make it onto social media, it's a lot more easier to keep them intimate, because you don't have to actually do that public curatorship. In fact, you find that a lot more curatorship is happening around intimate relationships, because those ones are a lot more sort of like, you're a lot more invested in them. So you show them in very particular ways that you are willing to have that relationship be judged on. This is a relationship that you don't necessarily care about, where you just like show it in whichever way, because if it goes, it goes. If it doesn't, it doesn't. So the curatorship aspect doesn't come because the relationship is not an intimate relationship. You might actually find that the curatorship is coming because it's actually a very intimate relationship, and it needs to be guarded through a created process where you are putting it up in such a way that it's being put up in ways that both of you, or however many people are involved in this picture or whatever it is you're talking about, the people will agree with, and that relationship won't be compromised.
Sure.
I didn't answer your question, but I went.
No, you definitely answered the question. And I think essentially it's about the fact that the boundaries are not, right? There's not a strict boundary, there's not a line between offline and online. These are spaces that are between and betwixt, they're all within each other. And it's essentially like kind of understanding that because they work with each other and they're happening at the same time, that's the reality of it. And we just have to kind of be in that space. And that's where children are. That's where we also need to get to real quick if we're not already. And I'm just also thinking about the fact that many youth are also using the online space as a means, like I said, of economic mobility, right? Of doing business from home, for example. They have a 5-year plan and slowly you start working towards a 5-year plan by doing certain things on social media, okay? Sometimes it's not a 5-year plan, but the point is there's something they're interested in, right? And they're doing it on social media. So Lebo, I want to speak about the aspect of youth or people building businesses online, right? And that when you're doing that, you're not just putting yourself in this space, but then you're also putting other people in your life in this space as part of building this particular business. Are there any implications or things to think about in terms of what it means when we're sharing information towards building something that is going to benefit us from a business or entrepreneurial point of view, but actually has other people involved?
I think it's just important, just in July, the Protection of Personal Information Act was enacted. And this deals with personal information and the sharing of personal information, the storage of personal information, the collection of personal information. So I think that it's important to be transparent and honest with people that you're sharing information with, or that you're asking information from them, and letting them know what you're doing with that information, and also allowing them to have access to that information. Because what that act does is that it allows the person that you're taking the information from to have the power, actually, because they have to consent and say, yes, you can use my information. What are you using my information for? Is it lawful? Is it reasonable? Do I have access all the time to this information so that I can update it, or so that I can change it, or so I can delete it in case you're using it for unlawful purposes? So you have to be reasonable. So the act allows you to be reasonable and lawful when you're using people's information. And they are, like, the fines are insane. You can be fined 10 million rand, even more, and prison time for 10 years if you're using someone's information without their permission or illegally, whether it's a minor or whether it's an adult. So I think that you need to be very, because data is a commodity, and they say it's the new oil. So you have to be very careful about how you use people's information now. You can't just take someone's information. I can't just take your email address just because I got it from somebody else. They have to ask for your permission and say, Naledi Lebo wants your personal information, your email address. Can I give it to her? So people have to be mindful of that act because it is in effect right now.
But what is consent then? How far does consent go? What does it actually mean to ask another person to use the information?
So consent is also being open about what I'm using the information for. So it's just like, Naledi, can I please use your email address? And then if you say yes, that is consent. You're agreeing that I use your email address. What is it for? I'm using it because I need to share it with somebody else, or I'm using it because I want people to have access to your email address for whatever reason. So consent, you have to agree that I can use your email address. You have to agree that I can share your pictures even. So that is also personal information. Your pictures are personal information. So it's you agreeing. And the thing is, you have to have control of what is out there. So consent is also about you having control and knowing what information about you is out there. So even those people that used to call you and ask you for insurance or say they want to sell you things, they're not supposed to do that unless you gave them consent to have your numbers. So now, because of this act, they can actually be held criminally liable. Where did they get your numbers? Why are they calling you for insurance? So other people, third parties, can't just give away your information. They have to ask you. So it's just about you monitoring what's out there. So keeping your information safe. So consent is you have control of what is out there and who can access your stuff, your pictures, your ID, your passport, whatever it is. You have control of who accesses it and who does not. And you have control of deleting it if you want to delete it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think, and that's why you see Facebook, that's why you see Facebook having a lot of problems and also being fined, because they are using people's information. Just because you signed up on Facebook, it doesn't mean that they can just take your pictures now and share your pictures. You have to give consent for them to share your pictures. You have to know who they're sharing the pictures with. They can't just share pictures, and they can't just use your information for their own purposes. They have to let you know first. Every time they want to use your pictures or any information for a different purpose than they told you, they have to notify you.
Right, okay. So it's, once again, it's kind of like this mixing between the public and the private space. So the kind of information that you share with someone in a private space, if you want to use it in public, you need to have there needs to be consent put forward that, friend, I want to do this particular business thing. I want to post something, a picture of the two of us in this particular way. Are you okay with that?
Yeah.
That's a very simple way of putting it, but it's like the private definitely comes into things that we're sharing publicly.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. Okay. So we have numerous questions that we actually haven't gotten to, so I'm going to do that. But apart from, before we actually get to the questions, so we raised a poll question earlier on about the generational gap. Is the older generation and the younger generation on two different spectrums? And the results that came through, I think people would have seen it. 44% of people believe somewhat, and 38% of people agree. So we can say that there's a larger proportion of us in this conversation who do believe that there's a particular divide between the younger generation, our generation, like end of millennial, and the older generation in terms of the digital era. So then it means that lots of work has to be done also by adults to bridge that divide, right? To get information and then have a conversation. Like I've heard a lot of what you guys have said is it's important to have the conversation with young people and not to actually have such divides between ourselves and them, as a way of actually also letting them in, and then more importantly, letting ourselves into their world. And that then also allows for connection and progression. Okay, so I'm going to get to the questions that have been posed. So let's see. On the note of social media sharing of information, nudes, etc., how do we educate children or youth if the environment at home is toxic or their parents practice such behaviors? Zamo.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. That's yours.
Everybody's like, well.
Did you have a question, or do you need me to repeat it for you?
I mean, I can speak to it, I think, to some degree.
Yeah. Cool.
You know, a little bit earlier when we were speaking, I was reminded of a very important and probably scary clinical truth, which is that, you know, you parent from the inside, and you also partner from the inside, actually, also. And that is very scary, because what that means is that, you know, a lot of stuff inside unresolved, not helpful, is going to come out when you parent. It's going to get activated, and you're going to potentially project it and spill it in, and so on and so forth, in many ways. So with that in mind, I guess a difficult answer is that you actually also work with the parents where you can. And that assessment is very difficult to make, though very important. So both in the work that we do at the Mbele Education Trust, as well as work with at the Children's Clinic at Tara, and so on and so forth, it's incredibly important not to blind the parent, especially because the child is going to go back there. Even when there's a great deal of frustration of the toxicity that they do bring and the perpetuation of really difficult things, is actually, once again, to bring them in, collaborate, and really try and work with their difficulties so that they are less difficult as parents themselves in a huge way. In fact, I'll tell you this much. Oftentimes I say to junior therapists and doctors and interns is that oftentimes actually the problem child is not coming to treatment themselves, they're bringing their parents. And if you can do that work with the parents, then actually the problem resolves, and or the parent is a lot more capacitated to resolve that problem and into the future in a huge way. So to concretely apply that to your question and the question asked, I would say that the education that we are disseminating should not just be pitched or directed just to children, adolescents, and young adults, it should also be directed to adults. There are too few kind of campaigns and or initiatives that are there to inform adults on these things, so that they can themselves have a transformed experience of them. They can have what we were referring to a little bit earlier, where you were speaking about including an informed perspective around what Twitter is, what Instagram is, so on and so forth, and how to use it, how not to use it in toxicity. Though also parents may also be able to really then be informed and educated around the impact of screen time even for them. Because of course, a lot of kids also just mimic screen time, and screen time is a big thing for me. And for them, it's about either ADHD, anxiety, and or high functioning depression that they're managing through high levels of screen time. So we work with them, and then the kid does something different in huge way. And thing. So I think that, of course, and always, we were speaking about consent, and I was thinking potentially from a researcher's position, it's about consent, but it's also about informed consent. So let me give you the information of what it is that you're consenting to. True. So I think also an informed approach, campaign to children is also incredibly important. So it's not just a dictation, but also a capacitating around why it is that this and that and the other is the case. Yeah. It may be quite roundabout a way to answer your question. I'm happy for follow-ups.
I'm going to ask follow-up to that actually. So that's individual, right? So let's think about the group context. If we have to do interventions at a more larger perspective, where we're educating people in groups as opposed to individually, what then can be done in terms of that?
And I think groups actually are probably, in South Africa, the better place to try and intervene. And I think for the longest time, they've been seen as the lesser way to intervene. Actually, you do want to intervene in groups for several reasons. One of my speciality actually is groups. And I won't go into all of the reasons why it is helpful. It's just effective also in a country with 70 million people, or 60 to 70 million people, and such few experts and so on and so forth. You want to intervene in groups. What group intervention also allows to do is it has residual impacts, because in a group, people are more likely to continue to speak about it and to interrogate it in a way that actually fosters depth, as opposed to a didactic one-on-one way of doing things. Human beings oftentimes find themselves in groups. Experts need to find those groups in order to find human beings in a huge way. One of the most expensive advertising spaces is that of sports, because sports brings people together in many ways. That's why it's so expensive. So once you get the concept that human beings, by and large, unless there's something wrong, will seek out groups, then you, if you want to be effective, will seek out the groups in order to find the human beings and then intervene there.
Right. Okay. And I guess this is the other thing, because we're having this conversation here, but it does infiltrate into many spaces. So if we're then able to think about the idea of how do we educate people at a group level about what we've spoken about today, marketing comes into play, right? The economics of it. Different companies can then angle things about what we're speaking about, digital related, at a group level in terms of their own marketing campaigns. The education department can also think about how then, in a classroom format, parent community meetings, how then can we also be speaking about digital and how it's affecting children at a larger level. Okay, so I also then want to pose the next question to Gabby. What impact will this era have on Afrocentric socialization on our African setting? i.e., we rarely talk to our kids about sex and all that is related to it. Yeah, because it's important, because we're a global world, but then we're still South Africa, right? So what does that mean for our cultural norms? How do we bring it into that?
I mean, I think what we're seeing on the internet is this really interesting blend of very highly particularized, individualized ways of being, and people looking for other people who are as close to that as possible, right? So I can be I can have a completely, I can immerse myself in natural hair, red hair, natural hair, caramel skin, whatever you want to call it, right? And be so particular in sort of like how I represent myself and set myself up on the internet, right? And at the same time, it allows these sort of like an infinite amount of other possibilities of very particular things or very broad things, depending on what it is exactly that you're looking for, right? So you get this very interesting intersectionality of being able to almost curate your value system in ways in which a lot of people didn't have for a long time, but also at the same time, you get to see what that curatorship looks like without having to try it out yourself. So you can see what happens or how, for example, people react to this way of seeing a particular value system, a particular sort of value system from a particular culture, when it's taken and packaged, because that is what happens. It's taken, it's packaged, and then it is internalized in various ways, right? So you can see how that happens and what that impact looks like without really having to sort of go through those teen years of trial and error and like finding myself. I can sort of do it sort of without really and decide, okay, that works, that doesn't work. So in terms of that value system, you find that it can do what it looks, it can do what looks like a disintegration, but at the same time, there is a way in which online representation makes people have to put themselves at a macro level as well as a micro level. There's a way in which in the ways in which when I post about myself on the internet, I have to know what it means for me as an individual and how I fit within a macro scale, right? So when I post about being a young Black woman, right? I'm posting about that politics of being female. I'm posting about that politics of being Black. I'm posting about that politics. So I'm already hinting or showing that, okay, I know that this exists, but then I'm also going to be particular about being natural, red-headed, and anthropologist, right? So I'm being both very particular and potentially very detailed in sort of the ways in which I post myself, but also very macro. So in ways in which we didn't have to when we were kids, I just had to know that I like a particular thing. How that fits into the global economy, I didn't have to think about it. I didn't have to think about what my culture means in terms of my relationship to my sexuality. I didn't have to think about what my culture means in relationship to my feminism. But those are conversations that a lot of us are having to have now in ways in which we've never. So even though it might seem like it might eat away at the sort of like Afrocentric culturalism, but it actually might allow that sort of conversation that we started off with, which is how do we acknowledge the change of culture when, for example, that hurt that has happened that no one wants to talk about, right? It is through sort of like these conversations of how do I relate this now to, so I think that it can work both ways. So it's not necessarily completely like a strip away from this Afrocentric view. It can actually work towards really building up interesting conversations about our Afrocentric ideas and views and value systems.
Right. I guess my social scientist mind is then thinking, I guess we also need to gather information about what's important for young people, for their parents to be sharing with them, and then what's important for older people in terms of that Afrocentric cultural norms. What priorities need to be maintained, even if we're having these intergenerational conversations around this.
Yeah.
Just one more question from the audience members. Out of interest, what does Instagram mean for low-income individuals, or even those unemployed on a psychological and social level, when socializing is shown to be in prestige restaurants, not repeating outfits on posts, holidaying, etc.? Right. Who's brave for that question? Zamo?
Not at all. I was thinking, like, these questions are like, you got an interview panel, like you had an interview for a top job. And it's thinking, look, I mean, I will answer, but I'll also invite my colleagues to answer. take it from there. I guess one of the immediate responses is, of course, it can be and is dangerous. And really, when you work with youth, both, again, adolescent and young adults, you get to know about the negative impact that social media can have. Really, it can on one's confidence, esteem, sense of self, development, character development, and so on and so forth. It really can be destructive. It can also be helpful, by the way. There are very many accounts out there which I think are really progressive and promote really helpful things. And, you know, more of that energy, please. I don't know. What would the kind of a teen say? More of that, I don't know, whatever, you know what I'm saying, like more of that. However, I want to caution against a vilifying of Instagram, so to speak, not just with my latter point, but also because we also need to be, you're right, we need to be individualistic, but also social about this. And the social scientist in me reminds me that socioeconomically, people, in fact, who are destitute cannot and do not access Instagram. And I think that there can be an echo chamber, which is even more dangerous, where we think our world is the world in reality. And it's kind of that blind naiveness of like going to somebody and saying, so what's your handle? With an imagination that they have the capacity to have a phone, which is smart, which has data, and so on and so forth, you know. And you saw that slightly different conversation, though I think relevant for this topic. You saw that in the discrepancy between fees must fall, data must fall, and bread prices must fall. And bread prices must fall did not make it onto Instagram because it was an irrelevant topic. So to that extent, my social comment is that perhaps we must be careful around the imagination that everybody has Instagram and therefore is impacted in a way that we think and imagine. And my last point is that I think that there's also some about rivalry, competitiveness, and envy, three siblings of internal psychological experiences, which are historical, universal, and pervasive. So before Instagram, it was the Skotani culture, and before that, it was the Jewishin culture, and before that, and before that, and before that, you know, even the things like Cheese Boy, all arise out of these three siblings around rivalry, competitiveness, and envy in huge way. And Instagram plugs into that potentially, though it is not the institutor of it or the institution of it, the instigator or the institution of it at all, you know. And I think one of the reasons I make that distinction is to then maybe call attention to the pervasive nature of these three siblings, which are quite important for us to attend to as a forum of people who are trying to enlighten and be as helpful as possible to our youth. How to manage rivalry, envy, and competitiveness.
Right. Okay. So yes, Instagram does create its own dynamics, but the point is different dynamics have been created over the eras. Right. We should also be mindful about that. So we're dealing with it before, we're still dealing with it today. We just need to find innovative ways of dealing with it in this current era. Okay, fascinating. Okay, so I'm going to one last question for everybody, and then we'll close the conversation. But just for everyone in the audience, this conversation will be available on the Tambo Foundation platform. And when you're sharing it, or when you're accessing it and sharing it to other people, remember to use the hashtag Tambo Webinar Series. So I'm going to ask everyone, just for closing comments from your side, what is one thing that you would like people to leave with today about socialization, about youth, about the digital era that we're in? We'll start with Lebogang.
I think with the digital era that we're in, I mean, we're in it, we cannot avoid it. And I think the only thing that we need to do is we need to embrace it. We need to use it in a beneficial way. I mean, we know that it can be harmful, but it can also be an amazing tool that is used in a beneficial way, in a way that can help us. It's there to also level the playing field, you know. Let's not look at it as this monster and this ugly thing that's there to take jobs. No, it's not. It's there to level the playing field. Let's use it to our benefit. Let's learn about it. Let's educate ourselves. And I think that when we do that, then we won't see it as the enemy. We will see it as something that we can collaborate with, as a friend, it's an ally to ensure productivity, to ensure efficiency, and to just ensure that we have access and opportunity. You know, the digital era is a digital encyclopedia that allows us access to a world of infinity and a world of possibility. So let's see it as that.
Cool, awesome, thank you. Gabby.
Okay, I think one of the things that has come up here is which actually Zamo just said now, is that a lot of the things we've discussed have gone back to the resolution of those things has been things that have existed throughout time. The idea of communicating with your kids, the idea of being invested and interested with you in what your kids are doing, the idea of, you know, ensuring that your kids trust you and being open-minded enough with your kids, the idea of you participating in the social economy of not just your generation, but also kind of, you know, the social economy of your children, right? So it's not, even though the social media, the internet is its own beast, and yes, it is a culture that has its own cultural values, norms, belief systems, and all of that. But it's also still something that's occurring within an offline environment that requires you and I, whether we're online or offline, whether we decide to buy data or not buy data, a cell phone or not, right? These are choices that we're making, not necessarily online. And the solutions to a lot of the problems are solutions that have existed throughout time. There's nothing new here that we are throwing out. All we are saying is we're trying to highlight the impact this has in everyday life. So that's new. How we fix it and how we ensure that we're continuing and people are thriving and everyone is good is old. It's predetermined. We know how it works, but we are too scared to go there. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, well said. Zamo, final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm struggling actually to think of anything to add. I think firstly from what my colleagues have said, I think it's incredibly well put, and I would love to just echo that, and also to remind us to try and have this perspective that we've been reflecting on towards the end, that there's also nothing really new about the internet, as much as the television was seen to be one thing at a point, and newspapers were seen to be one thing at a point, cell phones, and so on and so forth, you know. Yeah, you know, kind of, I think that there's an ability to harness and harvest that what is helpful and healthy about it, and to be cautious and attend to that what can be destructive in it. And I think conversations like this, which attend to it in a very deliberate way and detailed way, help to do that. So thank you, and as a result, thank you for putting this together and having these conversations, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the participants who've stayed on.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Lots to think about. Like there's been lots of sharing from different angles, right? If I have to think of a take home, and I can understand why Zamo, you said it's difficult to say one particular thing. But a few take homes that I can get from today's conversation is that it appears that the challenge is not with the youth. It appears that the challenge actually is with adults, right? And yes, there are negative implications to the online world, but there are also many positive implications. So then how then do we interact and work with children to make them aware of legally what's possible out there? What are the safety precautions that they need to be aware of? What are the emotional things? How much to balance being online and offline? Still prioritizing in-person interaction. But at the same time, it means as adults, then how do we immerse ourselves in the online world even deeper? So we're actually able to understand, take away the lens of looking down onto children, but actually having a conversation with them and then using their knowledge and how they're interacting as a means of therefore assisting them, but also then progressing as an African country, because that's also important. Digital is important, and we need to embrace that, right? So then take away our fear and kind of engage them more. So thank you very much for your thoughts on this. Yeah, that's all from my side. I guess I'm going to hand over now to the officials of the Tambo Foundation.
Thank you, Naledi.
Thank you so much to Naledi. Thank you, Gabby, Zamo, and Lebogang for that fascinating conversation. I'm so thrilled to have, like, I learned so much stuff. I'm a little bit traumatized because as I was listening to all of your perspectives, I realized I've turned into my mother, because I actually realized my own perspective of the internet. It reminded me of many years ago. I won't tell you around when, I'll tell you that I was a child, and my mother had this thing about the microwave, and it made absolutely no sense, but she was convinced that you could defrost, but that's the only thing it's good for. You couldn't cook, you couldn't preheat, because you must get cancer. There was no basis upon which she had this theory, other than that the microwave was new and we just had never seen it before. So she was automatically distrustful. So it was just so interesting to me, because as a parent, I think internet, I know all the wonderful things, but as a parent, I specifically think place of danger. I don't know what's happening here. But from listening to you and learning about how it's not, there's so much good there. I think that our instinct to protect the younger generation makes us, as you said, Naledi, more of the problem as opposed to being the solution. So thank you very, very much. There's so many angles and I couldn't possibly compress them now, but I think the overarching thing for me was that out of this conversation was, wow, the adults are, our perception of the internet feeds into the challenge of how we use it and therefore how our children use it. So thank you very much for that. I also want to say thanks to Brand South Africa and to the OR Tambo School of Leadership for joining us today and partnering with us. And last but not least, on Monday, the 30th of November, we'll be hosting Dr. John Gani for the last installment of our 10-year anniversary lecture series. And so it would be great if you would all join us, our panelists, as well as our audience. And it will, so if you want to get more information, there's going to be a slide just now when I finish speaking. And you can also follow at Tambo Foundation for more information. So thank you once again for joining us. Thank you very much to our facilitator and panelists. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience has too. Have a wonderful afternoon and enjoy your weekend.